Do you think your part of the world could be reached with the gospel within the next 10 years? I mean, could we really come to a point where we could say that the task is finished, there's no place left to work? As amazing and incredible as it sounds, that's what God did when Paul journeyed his part of the world and took the gospel message to the people who had never heard it before. What an incredible story. It begins with people breaking tradition and assumptions. It continues with Paul and his friends being accused of turning the world upside down. And it ends with Paul stating that his work is done. By the power of the Holy Spirit, he carried out the mission God had for him. In the span of 10 years, he walked over 2,400 kilometers, laying the foundation of multiplication so that about 22 million people could be reached. Let's follow Paul through Asia Minor and Europe on his 3 missionary journeys and see what happened. It starts in the spring of 46 AD. Barnabas and Paul are sent out by the Holy Spirit from Antioch. The believers in Antioch devotedly prayed for Barnabas and Saul as they sent them off. Paul broke some of the rules when he taught in the synagogues. He told non-Jewish people that they had a place in God's family too. But many of the Jewish people listening felt angry. The old paradigm and assumption quickly shifted in a matter of only 2 months. People were amazed. Jesus was for everyone, not just for the Jews. Because of jealousy, riots were started. Persecution was stirred up. Paul and Barnabas just shook it off and continued on their journey sharing the good news. They were leaving behind new disciples who were filled with joy and the Holy Spirit. The new believers felt strengthened and encouraged. Paul and Barnabas came back to their towns to appoint elders in brand new churches. As their first journey ended, Paul and Barnabas committed the new believers to the Lord and returned home. They praised God with those in Antioch for all he had done. In a matter of 12 to 18 months, there were communities of believers in major cities. Many non-Jewish people entered into God's kingdom. 3 centers of kingdom expansion had started and were growing. As Barnabas and Mark left for Cyprus, Paul was sent out with Silas. They felt a burden to strengthen the faith of new churches. Paul invited Timothy to join them along the way. The men felt amazed to see that the church was growing in numbers daily. They were joyfully obeying the Spirit's leading, and he made it clear where to go. They preached the gospel and started new communities of believers. Many of the authorities began to get upset with them. They saw how the gospel message upset their cultural norms. Paul and Silas rejoiced, praying and singing hymns even when they ended up in jail. Some devout Jews and city authorities were disturbed when they had heard Paul speak about Jesus. So many people were coming into the kingdom that Paul was accused of turning the world upside down. But they continued on, and the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily. The harvest was great everywhere they went. Paul had seen some fruitful responses during his travels. Until he reached Athens, there was not much interest. Paul endured opposition in Corinth. But in a vision, Jesus reassured Paul of his presence and protection and told him to go on speaking. As his second journey ended, Paul stopped by Ephesus in preparation for his next journey. He landed back in Syria, and the church there felt encouraged to hear about the impact of the gospel in his journey. They rejoiced that God's kingdom continued to expand. The same pattern of expansion and new churches with leaders raised up continued in every city. An increasing number of non-Jewish people entered the kingdom. There were now 5 centers of kingdom expansion. Paul felt his mission and purpose deeply, and it wasn't too long before he set out again. He went back to many of the young churches to encourage and strengthen the new disciples. Then, after encountering opposition, he settled into a ministry of equipping disciples in the Hall of Tyrannus for 2 years. The young disciples devoured the intense training and experience. And after only 2 years, all the residents of Asia heard the gospel, both Jews and Greeks. It was an exciting time, and God was doing extraordinary miracles. New believers made radical life changes, with their lives reflecting God's glory. Some people rejected the gospel, some remained curious and open. Still, others believed and learned how to tell others about their new life in Jesus. Paul targeted places strategically, and he shared the gospel everywhere he went. He discipled and empowered new leaders quickly. Churches reproduced to reach out broadly. Regional centers were reached and helped local ministry to expand. It was during this time that Paul wrote to the Roman believers, "I have fully presented the good news of Christ from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum. I have finished my work in these regions." Imagine seeing the foundation laid for your city or people group to be completely reached within the next 10 years. God is the same today as he was during the days of Paul. He still invites every person in the world to taste and experience his great love for them. He is still at work today, stirring up believers to reach an entire generation with the gospel. Isn't it amazing that God works through imperfect, regular people like you, me, and Paul to reach the world for Christ? As we follow his kingdom ways, we too can take part in the movement of the gospel, spreading across our cities and nations. God's Spirit indwells in you, and you're walking in the footsteps of believers who came before you. You have God's instruction book, the Bible, and we have each other, fellow believers. So let's be willing to be radical, fearless followers of Jesus.